Today marks 1 year since President Biden was sworn into office. He held a nearly 2-hour-long press conference on Wednesday afternoon, defending what he argued were his administration's accomplishments.
It's been a year of challenges, but it's also been a year of enormous progress. Unemployment dropped, child poverty dropped. We've seen record job creation, record economic growth. We have the tools: vaccines, boosters, masks, tests, pills. I have probably outperformed what anybody thought would happen.
He struck an optimistic tone for getting his agenda through Congress, much of which has stalled in the Senate, including voting rights legislation. After fielding questions about everything from Russian aggression to rising inflation, he ended the press conference with this acknowledgement.
If I've made a mistake, I'm used to negotiating to get things done, and I've been, in the past, relatively successful at it in the United States Senate, even as vice president. But I think that role as president is a different role.
Today also marks 5 years since the inauguration of former President Donald Trump. He left the office last year with an approval rating of 34%, the lowest number of any president since Gallup has kept track, starting in 1938. Mr. Trump continues to wield considerable influence in the Republican Party, and while he has remained officially non-committal on a 2024 White House bid, he has begun ramping up his political rally appearances. The former president also continues to insist that his election loss, along with the dozens of court losses attempting to prove widespread fraud, were the result of a fraudulent system. More than 100 sitting members of Congress tacitly backed this claim by refusing to certify President Biden's election win. Joining me now is Major Garrett and Tyler Pager. Major is CBS News chief Washington correspondent, and Tyler is a White House reporter for the Washington Post. Welcome. It's good to have you both. Major, let's start with President Biden. He set out 3 goals in his remarks on Wednesday: bolster the economy by, in part, fixing the supply chain, passing his social and climate spending bill, and promoting competition in business. Did he give specifics as to how?
Sure, and the first 2, Elaine, fall into the category of dealing with inflation, which is quite obviously the president's most important domestic, economic, and political issue to tame if he can in 2022. And on inflation, the president said it's a global problem. He's right about that. He said supply chain plays some role in that. He's also correct about that. And he said the infrastructure bill will help smooth out continued kinks in the supply chain. Voters will determine if that's true. When it came to the other part of his legislative agenda, Build Back Better, he acknowledged one thing he had never acknowledged before. It's going to have to be broken up into small parts. And he said if a couple of component parts of that are passed, not clear that they will be, but if they are, providing subsidies for child care and elder care, both of those could deal with inflation because Americans spend, the president said, a good portion of their incomes, especially lower middle class and those Americans in poverty, on elder care and child care. The president said those would address inflationary concerns. In terms of promoting competition among businesses, the president acknowledged he signed an executive order, limited authority there. Congress is probably not going to help him very much there, but he can use the regulatory clout of the federal government to deal with preventing consolidation of businesses going forward. There's not much this administration can do about breaking apart consolidated industries now without a lot of breaking of regulatory furniture, and the president has been clear about that. So in essence, that's how the president approached and said he would approach those 3 issues.
Well, Tyler, the president admitted a passage of his Build Back Better plan may be piecemeal, saying he thinks big chunks of it can get passed. He put a price tag of more than $500 billion on energy and the environment. Did he move the goalposts at all, and do you see him getting Republican support on climate change?
Look, I think this is something that Democrats are eager to try to resume conversation on after the failure to make any sort of progress on voting rights. But we heard today from Senator Manchin, the holdout on that Build Back Better agenda, that his counteroffer was off the table and that they need to start over negotiations on whatever a Build Back Better package may look like. Even the name Speaker Pelosi said today might be up for debate. In terms of President Biden moving the goalposts, I think he is just looking to get some sort of deal done. And whether that is just pieces of the Build Back Better agenda, whether that's just climate and energy, or it includes some other social spending, I think he's eager to find agreement and get this bill across the finish line. I think it's incredibly unlikely we see any sort of engagement from Republicans on this. They've been uniformly opposed to any sort of any piece of this Build Back Better agenda as it worked its way through the Senate. Initially, I think as they move forward on this, it's going to really come down to what they can get Senator Joe Manchin to agree on, and that's ultimately what the president's going to be able to get done.
Major, is there any incentive at all for Republicans to work with this White House on any issue, climate or any other issue?
Politically, the short answer is no, Elaine. And this really goes back to a very fateful decision President Biden and his team made right after taking office. And I remember during our continuous coverage on Inauguration Day, I said one of the big decisions President Biden is going to have to make is for his domestic agenda. Will it be bipartisan or will it be partisan? Will he use the reconciliation tool that avails in the Senate to move certain items through on a straight partisan basis? You don't need to meet a 60-vote threshold. And the White House decided to use that process not once but twice. And once with the American Rescue Plan, it succeeded. But with Build Back Better, it was always going to be a much more difficult process. But the White House said it was going to use that purely partisan approach. Well, Republicans said, all right, if you're going to be partisan, we're going to oppose you every step of the way. Having now successfully opposed the White House and, for all intents and purposes, I think Tyler would agree with me on this, nullifying any prospect of that bill passing in any shape or form, Republicans are now in the midterm election year where they're even more incentivized to stoke partisan oppositional attitudes in order to keep their Republican base motivated and energized heading toward the midterm election. So the White House now has reaped what it has sown, a partisan attempt to pass a second huge piece of legislation that has now largely fallen apart, and any prospect of negotiating with Republicans in good faith in an election year are dim.
So, Major, as you know, President Biden, for his part, took issue with what he said was Republicans' failure to bring ideas to the table. Here's some of that.
Think about this. What are Republicans for? What are they for? Name me one thing they're for.
All right, so Major, you regularly speak with both Democrats and Republicans for your excellent podcast, The Takeout. But what do Republicans say that they are for?
Well, that is a kind of a quaint observation, and any president who's facing difficulty in a legislative process always likes to fall back on that. I've watched many presidents say that. Well, the opposition doesn't have any really good, genuine ideas. Guess what? In oppositional politics right now, it's not really a requirement. All you need to do is marshal the forces to stop something, and then you can work on a better idea later on. Now, Republicans in the House side say they're formulating a positive agenda that they'll put forward, kind of like Republicans did in 1994, seeking power in the House of Representatives through the contract with America. Maybe that will materialize, maybe it won't. But what Republicans do say they're for is, for example, a much sharper focus, rhetorically and otherwise, from this administration on the question of immigration. What are you doing to deter those coming from the border, to the border rather? What are you doing to strengthen the United States border? And if you're not going to do some of the things that President Trump did, what are you going to do? Republicans have a kind of a series of questions for this administration on why don't you focus on immigration? And what about these numbers of either people being stopped or people getting across and your various policies on the border? Republicans also ask rhetorically and from a policy perspective, why doesn't this administration talk about something that continues to show up in the public polling data, which is concern about violent crime and rising violent crime rates in many American cities? Federal government can't do a lot about that, but it can do some things at the margins. Republicans ask this administration, why don't you focus on that? Why do you have to be asked about these two issues that time and again show up in public polls as areas of voters' concern? So when you're in the opposition, you don't need to have ideas necessarily that are better, but you can raise concerns about things that you find the public is also concerned about. And that's where Republicans are.
So, Tyler, during his press conference, President Biden seemed to suggest the results of the 2022 midterms could be illegitimate depending on voting laws and whether some states continue to perpetuate former President Trump's false assertion of widespread election fraud. Now, Jen Psaki, the White House press secretary, as well as Vice President Harris, both seemed to clarify those remarks today. But President Biden has often complained about former President Trump's undermining of the electoral system. Is what he said any different?
Yeah, look, I don't think it was the most artful moment of the president's almost 2 hours freewheeling news conference yesterday. And I think the point that he was trying to make was that he has concerns about interference in the overseeing of elections, which we ultimately, concluded in January 6th in the insurrection. I think any effort to dissuade Americans from having full confidence in elections is problematic. And I think that is what we heard in the cleanup from Jen Psaki and Vice President Harris as they sought to clarify and correct those comments. But I do think, look, it is not productive for American democracy to have the president or any other senior officials casting doubt on the integrity of elections. Obviously, this has been a problem that we have seen former President Donald Trump be a leader of in casting doubt in the integrity of the 2020 elections. And Biden and other Democrats have been forceful in calling out and criticizing those efforts. And so I think, what the president was trying to say was that he's concerned about the other side and Republican-led efforts to roll back voting rights or restrict the right to vote. But as you said, it is unproductive and unhelpful to general American confidence for any American leader to make comments that potentially cast doubt on Americans' confidence in elections.
Major, it's been 5 years since former President Trump's inauguration. Here's some of what he said on that day.
What truly matters is not which party controls our government, but whether our government is controlled by the people. January 20th, 2017 will be remembered as the day the people became the rulers of this nation again. The forgotten men and women of our country will be forgotten no longer.
So, Major, as someone who has covered Donald Trump for a very long time, I want to get your sense of what we should expect here from the former president in 2022. We've seen him reemerge recently, taking a more prominent kind of role with these rallies and essentially repeating these baseless claims of fraud. But give us your assessment. First of all, do we have any clarity on what his 2024 intentions are? And what should we expect to see from the former president here ahead of the midterms?
The best way to describe former President Trump's intentions for 2024 is to freeze the field of potential Republican challengers as long as he possibly can. And former President Trump is in a unique position of particular power in the Republican Party 2024 conversation. Why? Because if he runs, he's likely to be the nominee and almost unstoppable, which means he has a very long time to wait. He does not need to jump into the race, should he decide to do so, until nearly right up before the primaries, if he wants to wait that long. And if he does wait that long, guess what? All the Republicans, and there are many, at least a half a dozen, maybe as many as a dozen, who are putting together potential startup campaigns should former President Trump not decide to run for re-election or another term, not re-election, but another term in 2024. And so what we can say for sure is former President Trump will freeze that field as long as he can. And while that process plays out, do something else that's very important, which is continue to galvanize that part of the Republican Party most loyal to him and most likely to participate in Republican primaries. President Trump is not a particularly powerful force in national politics right now. He is a very powerful force in Republican primary politics. And much of what you don't hear in terms of criticism of President Trump or alignment with him, tacit or otherwise, with the big lie or other parts of the agenda, is because Republicans are terrified of crossing him and inviting a primary challenge. Now, that does tend to dissipate where there is not a clear Republican fearful of a primary challenge. In open races, and there'll be many in this coming election cycle, there'll be Republicans vying to be the most Trumpian. And they may cancel each other out. They may fight over primary election results. And that's something I'm going to keep a very close eye on, Elaine. How do Republicans argue among themselves about primary outcomes they may not respect as valid? Continuing out this idea that President Trump has infected and injected into our system that any outcome other than your victory has to be suspect or questioned. That's one part of the Republican conversation that former President Trump will involve himself quite heavily in. And we don't know if that will be to the Republican Party's benefit or to its long-lasting injury.
I guess, Major, I'm also wondering, are there moderates still in the Republican Party in sizable enough numbers that they would have an influence in a primary kind of situation?
Short answer, no. And we really have to change our terminology, I think, Elaine. Moderates, conservatives, I mean, I think right now, for the Republican Party, you are either Trumpist or non-Trumpist. You are either aligned with the policies, the rhetoric, or the attitudes of Donald Trump, or you are not. You either consider them essentially helpful to the Republican Party and not injurious to the Constitution or our understanding of American democracy, or you don't. And there's a small part of the Republican Party that doesn't. Liz Cheney is the leader of that, if there is, in fact, something large enough to constitute something that she's a leader of. But it's a very small part of the Republican Party now. Doesn't mean it always will be. This conversation is continuous. American democracy is continuous, at least we hope it is. But Republicans right now, in the party that is defined by this approach of former President Trump, is either Trumpist or not. And the Trumpist wing of the party is by far the largest.
Tyler, let me ask you, there have been significant developments with the investigation into January 6th. What do we know about Chairman Thompson's letter to Ivanka Trump?
Yeah, so big news today from the January 6th investigation that the committee wants to interview and receive documentations from President Trump's daughter, Ivanka Trump, saying that they have reason to believe that she has information about what the president was doing before, during, and after the January 6th insurrection, and that in particular, she was privy and witness to Donald Trump's efforts to get Vice President Mike Pence to overturn the results of the election. And so this is part of a wide-ranging effort from the January 6th Commission led by Chairman Benny Thompson, the congressman, to interview and get documents from a wide range of Republican officials, many of whom who work directly with former President Donald Trump. Obviously, Ivanka Trump is one of the closest aides to her father, serving in a senior role in the White House, and just shows the level of detail and escalation of this investigation, of them closing in on the former president as they reach out to a wide circle of people, but also those who were and remain closest to him.
All right, Major Garrett and Tyler Pager, thank you both very much.